Well, hello, Matt, and hello, Ian, and welcome to everyone who will be watching this, perhaps a promo conversation that anticipates an upcoming conference that we want to share with you all and discuss a bit. My name is Andrew Davis. I'm the program director for the Center for Process Studies. We're a nonprofit think tank that is, for over 50 years, been developing conferences, book series, course materials surrounding process relational philosophy. So our work is very much indebted to Whitehead, certainly, but not just Whitehead, others, Friedrich Schelling, Henri Bergson, Teilhard de Chardin, and a host of others. And I'm happy to be joined with my good friend Matt Segall of the California Institute for Integral Studies, and of course, Iain McGilchrist, to discuss a conference that's coming up in March 29th to the 31st, the title of which is Metaphysics and the Matter with Things Thinking with Iain McGilchrist. So Matt, maybe you can introduce yourself and say a little bit more about the conference, and we can get off and running with the conversation.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, really glad to be able to join both of you this morning for me, evening for Ian, later in the morning for Andrew. And I'm very excited for CIIS and the Center for Process Studies to collaborate on this conference. So first such collaboration, and what a way to kick things off by welcoming Ian and a cast of really brilliant thinkers to join us in conversation about Ian's work. I teach, I'm faculty in the philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness program, which is a very interdisciplinary program. Many of our students will be in attendance and eager to be in dialogue with everyone there. And so what we hope to do in this little promo video is let people know that unfortunately in-person tickets are totally sold out. Namaste Hall at CIS will be housing our conversation for 3 days over this weekend, Easter weekend actually, in late March, but we have an indefinite number of online registration spots available. And so, yeah, why don't we transition now? And Ian, as a sort of opening question for you, I mean, you've done so many talks and interviews over the last several years as your work has resonated quite deeply with a whole variety of different audiences and researchers because of its the poignancy of the diagnosis that you're making of modern culture and the dangerous direction that we are headed in. But just to sort of set the scene, I wonder if you could speak a little bit, since our conference is titled Metaphysics and the Matter with Things, how it is that you found your way from this research in clinical neuroscience to these deep metaphysical questions, especially the ones you explore in the second half of volume 2. When did those connections start to arise for you, and when did you realize you needed to begin to write about this?
Well, I mean, first I'd just like to say how pleased I am to be talking to you and how honored and somewhat overwhelmed I am by having such a star-studded cast of people coming together to discuss my work. But in answer to your question, I think it might be the other way around. So it might be that the metaphysical questions led me to the study of neuroscience in the first place. So it was concerns about the mind-body relationship and what was being missed in my area of the humanities, which was the study of literature, that led me to think, you know, the philosophers are fine on the mind-body relationship, but in some ways they're too disembodied altogether in their approach. And I wanted to be more embodied, and that took me to medicine. So rather late in life compared with most young things, at least in Britain, who study medicine. I at the grand old age of 28, I started to study medicine. And I knew I wanted to go into the area of overlap between neurology and psychiatry, which is indeed where I went. And it was the questions that kept arising during my training, and then even more once I was qualified and was at the Maudsley Hospital in London, meeting patients and so on, about the meaning of the way in which our brain works one particular aspect of it being its divided nature, why this was at all, why the brain was asymmetrical, why the connection between it was rather tenuous and getting more tenuous over time rather than more accentuated, and that a lot of its activity was inhibitory. And so this set me thinking about the two different kinds of world that the two hemispheres create. And I mean, this is not the normal way, I must hasten to say, in which people who come more conventionally to neurology think. They think in terms of symptoms and causes, but they don't so readily think, are not encouraged really to think about what the inner world of the patient is like. What is it like when something goes wrong in part of your brain? I mean, and I don't just mean, we've got to treat this symptom. I mean, the whole experience. And what became clear to me through one way or another was that the two hemispheres attend to the world entirely differently. They have different modes of attention. They're involved in everything. It's not that, as we used to say, the left hemisphere does this and the right hemisphere does that, but it's to do with attention. And it was really the kind of unfolding of the import of this insight that when you attend to the world in two completely different ways, you find a different world there to attend to. And then this started to resonate with the issues I'd had when I was writing about the business of literary criticism and what its strengths and weaknesses were. And increasingly, I began to see that it had something to say about our contemporary world, in that something has happened in the last couple of 100 years, which seems to be that we've skewed the way in which we look at the world towards the take of just one hemisphere at the expense of what the other one could tell us. And the unfortunate reality is that the one we're attending to is less intelligent, less, by a very long way, insightful, more dangerous, and believes it knows everything. And if you have to characterize these hemispheres in a rather simplistic way. And so this has consequences for us. The fact that we're seeing the world in a very limited way, which has been foreign to most peoples over time in most parts of the world, is pretty important. It was exploring that I wanted to do. And that was, the first book was The Master and His Hemisphere, in which I was laying out the differences neurologically and philosophically. And in the second part, looking at different phases in the history of Western thought in which we had either got the balance between these two takes on the world reasonably well, and those corresponded with areas in which, or periods, eras, I should say, in which civilization flourished, and those in which, in every case, the left hemisphere became predominant and the civilization collapsed. And the second book on this topic, The Matter with Things, which came out in 2021, was an exploration of the philosophical consequences, which I hadn't gone into in such great detail in The Master and His Emissary. So that's how it got me into, how do we know that anything is true? I mean, I take it that our brains are part of the apparatus whereby we make decisions about what is true. And if they have different ways of even understanding truth, never mind of seeing the world, how do we find out what we can trust? And so the book embraces neuropsychiatry or neuropsychology, then epistemology, which paths to truth can we employ, and finally, as you hint, metaphysics, what kind of a cosmos seems more probable out of the alternatives that are offered to us by different approaches.
Yeah, if I can follow up on that briefly, and then I'll hand it off to you, Andrew. It seems that, as you're saying, the brain is both our means of access to the world, but also, in some sense, an expression of the world and sort of the evolutionary process that has brought us here, right? And so there's a bit of recursive loop going on here, where we're trying to understand how the brain shapes our cognition of the world and reality, and why it would be that the world would give rise to a divided brain in this way, or why there would be hemispheres, not just in our species, of course, but in many animal species that we descend from. So that's a deep metaphysical question that I'm sure we will explore here. But before we go there, I wonder if you can, for people who might be skeptical of the hemisphere hypothesis, there was a time maybe in the 90s when it was quite popular and oversimplified, right? And you go to great lengths, particularly in volume 1 of The Matter with Things, to lay out the clinical evidence for why we should be taking this hemisphere hypothesis seriously, and that those who dismiss it need to look again at this evidence. Can you talk a little bit about, the emergence of this theory in the mid 20th century, and the journey that it's gone on in terms of its popular appeal, and your attempt to recover it so that people will take it seriously, because it seems to have, at least among some scholars, because of how popular it became in decades prior and oversimplified, it's been dismissed when actually we need to look at it much more closely.
Yes, I think that's right. The idea that because we had got the answer to the question, what is the difference between the hemispheres, wrong, should lead us to abandon the question. That's illogical. The question had the wrong answer. Most of the things that we used to say about hemisphere difference have been shown ultimately to be wrong. Not every single thing, but most of it is wrong. But that doesn't mean to say that there aren't better answers. And it's the attempt to give a better answer to the question that I have been working for a few decades. Yes, I mean, way back in the 60s, I mean, there were hints of hemisphere difference going a long way back, in fact, as far as the ancient Greeks. But it really sort of took off with the advent of the operation called commissurotomy, in which the corpus callosum, the band of fibers that connects the two hemispheres at their base, was surgically divided in order to help people with intractable epilepsy regain a life, because they hardly ever stopped having seizures. And of course, this gave us an opportunity to examine one hemisphere at a time by setting experiments up in a clever way. And the results of this were overinterpreted and generalized and misunderstood, I believe, because of the question we were asking. This is the main thing, I think. We were asking the question, what does the brain do? Because we simply assumed that the brain was a machine. I mean, it might be a software or a soft, soggy machine, but it was a machine. But indeed, I believe that the whole machine model in biology, neurology, psychology is deeply mistaken, and that's a whole other topic. But if instead you ask the question, not what do they do, but how do they do it, each of them approaching a certain way and looking at the world differently, or each approaching a different faculties such as attention, perception, imagination, intelligence, emotional and social intelligence, and the usual cognitive intelligence of IQ. And what we find there is that each of them is involved. That is exactly right. But they do it in a quite different way, leading to a different picture of the world. And that in almost every case, the right hemisphere is superior to the left hemisphere. You may think that must be to do with putting one's finger in the scales. I mean, why would one of the hemispheres be so much less good at giving us an account of reality? And the answer to that is that from an evolutionary point of view, that was not its job. Its job was not to waste time thinking about what all this means or how the picture fits together. It was simply to get. So it was targeted, the attention was targeted on something we already knew, that we knew we needed, and we fixed it, we stared at it, we grabbed it, we got it. And it's this process, controlled by the left hemisphere, which controls the right hand, which for most of us is what does the grabbing. This is its raison d'etre. And it's very much better at that than the right hemisphere. So if you want to grab things, manipulate them, make tools, machines, and so forth. This is the hemisphere to do that. But unfortunately, the sacrifice that is made is that it doesn't really understand what it's dealing with. The nature of what is going on is very, very simple. And it's somewhat like the difference between a map and the world that is mapped. So I would make the distinction: the left hemisphere holds the map, and part of that mapping is language, which it relies on more than the right hemisphere. And the right hemisphere has the real world that is being mapped. I just thought to sort of slightly gloss there the language thing, because the right hemisphere makes important, very important contributions to language that are probably more important for the understanding of a whole utterance than anything in the left. But this is the way it's gone. But it became unpopular. I've sort of shot on past the period of doldrums at the end of the 20th century, when it just became increasingly discredited. Piece after piece of evidence showed that each hemisphere was involved in everything, which is indisputable. And it got a kind of pop thing that the left hemisphere was kind of rather boring, like some sort of accountant, but at least was reliable. And the right hemisphere was sort of airy-fairy and fluffy and creative, but ultimately not dependable. It actually turns out, as an aside on that the right hemisphere is much more down to earth, much more reliable than the left, which is frequently deluded, over-emotional, dismissive, doesn't know what it is it doesn't know. So that was what happened. And it was, if I may say so, I mean, it was my colleague John Cutting and I who really have, between us, tried to resurrect a thesis that there is an important difference between the hemispheres. I owe an enormous debt to John Cutting, but he faced what was inevitable, which was that people said, "Oh, don't research on that because we know it's all rubbish." In fact, he did a lot of very painstaking work, and he was also unusual for a neuroscientist in that he was very interested in phenomenological philosophy and knew it very well. And so he found that there were extraordinary insights that came from applying the knowledge of the real differences between the hemispheres, which are much subtler than those that used to be bandied around, to our understanding of the world in phenomenological terms. And I have kind of run with that in these last two books. But the first thing I have to get over always is, oh, all that stuff about hemispheres is rubbish. Yeah. Okay, so you know it all. Great. But if you actually want to know a little bit more, try reading what I've written about it. And it's not as though there's no evidence. I think between the two books, I probably refer to about 6,500 pieces of research that show that there are indeed important differences.
Yeah, well, wonderful, Ian. Following up on that, since I believe you mentioned it was 2021 when The Matter of Things came out. Since then, it seems like you've been on a non-stop train of conversations and lectures. And our conference, it anticipates deepening that in a significant sense. But I wonder, what out of all the conversations you've been in concerning your work, which are some of the ones that stand out to you more? And then as a follow-up, what sort of pushback have you received beyond just this notion you've now helped dismiss, this idea that this is just a already dismissible notion? But what are some of the critiques, either in the theory or in the metaphysics, which you have found to be significant? I'm curious to hear what you would say to that.
Yes. Perhaps I should tackle that part first, really.
Sure.
I think the most common pushback I've had, well, originally, but I don't think anyone holds that now, was that I hadn't sort of researched it properly. I mean, I don't think you can really ask for anyone to have researched it over a longer period more thoroughly than I have. More commonly, people say, if they're from the neuro world, there are some who say, oh, hemispheres, it's all nonsense, but they're also getting many, many fewer. But a more thoughtful response is, yeah, the neuroscience is very interesting. I get this a lot. The neuroscience is fine, no problem with that. But then you start trying to relate it to the world of ideas. And I'm not comfortable with that. So it's like neuroscience is something that just goes on in the lab, has no implications for human beings. Um, and that's not a position that any clinician would ever take, because if you're a neurologist, a psychiatrist, or a neuropsychiatrist, you see all the time the evidence that, surprise, surprise, the brain is quite important for the experience of a human being. And it changes in predictable ways what that human being experiences. Now, once you've made that, then you can see that there should be a knock-on for the kind of ideas, the kind of ways in which a group of people think, if they start to espouse just one of these takes and to the expense of the other. The other kind of group are people in the humanities who go, look, the neuroscience may be right, I really can't judge, but your analysis of civilizational history is fascinating. I don't think it really needs all this neuroscience. So you get these two factions, each of them saying, as far as our stuff goes, yes, that's right. But why put these together? Now, that is fascinating, because I think it's part of the way in which our whole intellectual world has fallen apart into silos, and indeed education at school, at least in Britain, I suspect everywhere, has become much less humane and general than it was in the past. So it's become much more centered on the inculcation of techniques rather than on the examination of ideas through the eyes of great thinkers and writers of the past, and in other ways like music and painting and so forth. So that aspect, which grounds us in the world and gives us some idea of where we stand in relation to our past, and therefore the future that is coming, that has been neglected. And so what's lovely about this conference is that we're bringing people together in an interdisciplinary way. And Matt said in what he wrote to me, interdisciplinary or perhaps transdisciplinary. And I wasn't quite sure of the distinction he was making, but perhaps Matt can tell me. But what is the difference, Matt?
Well, interdisciplinary would imply that, the neuroscientists are over here, the biologists over here, the physicists and the philosophers over there, and we talk to each other and exchange ideas. Whereas I think transdisciplinarity would be taking it a step further, where, it's not just that I'm going to continue to wear my biology hat and, this other person will continue to wear their physics hat or whatever, but we actually try to internalize the perspectives of one another and develop a method whereby we could take the holistic view, each of us, right?
Yeah.
And this is really what I think metaphysics, or perhaps to qualify it, an integral metaphysics would really be striving to do, to bring together two cultures that C.P. Snow recognized were splitting, the sciences and the humanities, to overcome dualism between the mind and the body, and to really take in the whole picture again. And I think, as you've been saying, our universities and the way that we structure knowledge production, as it's called nowadays, is so siloed and fragmented that and there's a lot of careerism, right, where people don't want to step outside the lane of their special focus because they risk being criticized for talking nonsense because they're not speaking the right jargon of the other discipline that they're crossing into, So transdisciplinary, is just trying to bring the world back together so that we can take informed points of view on the biggest questions that matter for all of our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought that probably must be the basis of the distinction. And I think it's hugely important that we do this, because if we just carry on taking a very particular stance, each of us, we won't be able to see what is going on as a whole. And it's that needs to be seen if we're if we come to the point about where the world is going, that I don't, we talk about the meta crisis, and I don't think that there's a crisis in just what we're doing to the natural world, and another crisis to do with the fragmentation of society and so on. I think they all form, and the crisis of mental illness, I think they all come together, and they come together for me in something that is profoundly illuminated by hemisphere theory. So that's where it's at. And I suppose, to come back to the unanswered half of Andrew's question, the most appealing conversations I've had have been with people who are prepared to stand outside of their single silo, so to speak. And they've been people like Michael Levin, who's, of course, going to be part of this conference. I've had a number of very, I think, interesting, certainly for me, conversations with him, and I find him a broad-minded person in that way. And there are philosophers who are very interested in my theory. So, for example, Rupert Reed in Britain, but there are people in different parts in France, in other parts of the world, who have connected with my thinking, and see that, in fact, neuroscience is not irrelevant to our understanding of consciousness, and therefore of the aspects of consciousness, such as a worldview.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Iain, as you know, and we were mentioning this interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary dimension of this conference, and one aspect we, of course, couldn't leave out, given your work, is this element of spirituality and the sacred. And I wonder if there's an interesting parallel with your own biography here, because I recall, that you could correct me though, in your early life, you had an initial interest or love for philosophical theology, but then were detoured by perhaps your advisor saying, well, that's not an honest degree.
That's right.
And I wonder if that sort of notion parallels certain advice you received to not include a chapter that would say initially what this all comes to in terms of speaking of the sacred or God, a term that I think for all of us carries a lot of baggage, and yet you pursued and continued with it. You found it necessary to really, I see, culminate the book with this long discussion, nearly over 100 pages itself, a book on the sacred and how hemisphere hypothesis helps us think through how to rethink that. So maybe you could say a little bit further about that. I know it was difficult for you as well. I've heard you express that several times.
It was the most difficult thing I've ever written. But I have been very pleased with the reaction from theologians. In fact, in February, I'm going to Cambridge to deliver a Darwin lecture, but after it, the next day, I'm meeting with a group of theologians in Cambridge to discuss that aspect of my work, which is wonderful. And I've had wonderful conversations several times with Rowan Williams, who I much respect and admire and honor. So, yes, I mean, the thing was that, in a nutshell, I didn't have a religious upbringing until in my teens I went to a school where I was suddenly acquainted with the long Western Christian culture, its wonderful music, its liturgy, and so on. And it made a huge impact on me. And I realized that it wasn't all about believing strange propositions. It was about a way of being in the world, and that this was embodied in poetry, in myths, and in rituals and music and so forth. And I, in fact, had decided that at the point of leaving school, I might go to university and study theology, but I would go into a monastery. And this was a youthful misjudgment. But there we are. But all my life, I've held on to this sense that the really important thing is the relationship to the divine. I now know from psychological research that actually having this relationship to the divine is very beneficial to us, but that's not a good reason for adopting it either. I mean, it's a misconception to utilize it in that way, and you can't really believe something you don't believe in any case. But no, I found myself wanting to write this as the keystone of the exploration of how do we get to what we can call true? Because nowadays truth has been travestied. Actually, and in Oxford in February, I'm giving a lecture on the universes and truth, and what has happened to truth, and why the unwillingness to embrace the idea that there are truths, not dogmas, and there isn't just one certain truth, but some things are truer than others, has damaged the value of the university, and maybe, in fact, contributing to its demise. But in any case, the first part of my book, The Matter with Things, the first volume is called The Paths to Truth, and the second volume is called What Then Is True? I mean, you noted it as a question, because I don't come up with an answer, but I do suggest that there are things that are truer than others. And the keystone to this was the way in which we understand our relationship to the cosmos. And my belief is that without a sense of the sacred, we are missing out on something enormously profound that has been a huge part of human experience, as far as we know, in the entirety of human history. So, but my friends who are philosophers said, they despaired of me because they had read the rest of the book up to that point and said, this is a really very interesting philosophical work, but if you put something in about the sacred, nobody will take you seriously. And in fact, that hasn't happened. The only kickback I've had has not been from atheists, but from religious people who say that I wasn't sufficiently religious in my approach. But anyway, that's beside the point. But I do think that it's terribly important. And in some ways, although I'm not sure I even mentioned the word God in The Master and His Hemisphere, I probably do somewhere because I'm talking about the Reformation. I see it really as a work of crypto-theology, not that it's expounding anything in terms of academic theology, but that it's encouraging us to look at the world with a different disposition, which is one that would be open to what is needed if one's going to understand the divine, i.e. not that it can all be neatly encapsulated in language and concepts, that it may require embracing things that can only be implicit, that may superficially appear to contradict one another, but actually on further exploration enrich one another. And the general trend towards either this or that, and let's clarify this point and so on, is acting to impair one's understanding of something that is nonetheless real for not being capturable in scientific terms or in the kind of everyday language that people would like it to be captured in.
Wonderful. And I was just thinking as you were speaking, if it's any consolation, you'll know that Whitehead culminates his great process of reality with this part 5 on God and the world, and he too received much pushback. Some people stopped following him. So there's a lot bound up with this language of God. But I tend to like Karl Rahner's notion, and he has a beautiful meditation on just the word God in Foundations of Christian Faith. And he essentially argues that without this term, we are not even yet human, right? It's an interesting relation between our humanity and this term. So, well, I am glad you included that.
All I'd say about that is that without this experience, we might be not human. But the word is slightly a stumbling block, I think.
Sure.
So I say what we need is an unword. If we have no word, then the concept disappears from our thinking and our discourse. But that particular word, God, is so laden with particular overtones from many people that it stops them seeing a profound reality that is really what life is about, in my view.
Might be why, in the Jewish tradition, often the word will be crossed out, or, you're not actually allowed to say the name, or nobody even knows how to properly pronounce the name of God.
That's right.
To protect it from abuse and misuse and a flattening that, squeezes out the numinosity.
Yes. It also reminds me slightly of Heidegger's, moving from Sein, S-E-I-N, to Sein, S-E-Y-N, an older spelling, and then finally to Sein crossed out.
Yeah.
Because every attempt to say this pinned it down to something that it wasn't.
Well,
But
I think, oh, I'm sorry, Ian, I just think that there was an expression of a deep apophatic dimension to your work as well.
Exactly.
Almost
It
from
is.
the coincidence of opposites in the very beginning of the third part all the way to the end. There's this humility with respect to what language can actually accomplish, this apophatic dimension.
Yeah.
Dasein crossed out.
Well, I think also of something Whitehead says in his little book, wonderful book, Religion in the Making, where he says a religion can be defined as a system of general truths which have the effect of transforming character when they are sincerely held and vividly apprehended. So the point is not just that you believe the right thing and will go to heaven as a result of the belief in some proposition, as you were saying, but it's more about how those propositions transform you as a person, right? So it's not what you believe, it's who you are, right? That's what's of primary importance in the context of religion. And it seems to me that in the modern period, those who do tend to grasp rather, tightly on religion and become more fundamental in their belief, fundamentalist in their belief, are missing that. And it becomes more about the propositions than it does about the transformation of character, right?
Exactly. I sometimes make a distinction between belief being a matter of disposition rather than a matter of propositions. The propositions have their place. And the one that I thought most ridiculous in Christianity in my early years is now one I see as enormously profound, which is the concept of the Trinity, which really didn't even start with Christianity, but has been part of many religious traditions. And I thought, well, what is this about the man, the boy, and the bird, so to speak? But I really can't believe this one. But I talk about it a little in the book, but I now think of it as an extremely important insight into the relationship between transcendence and immanence.
Yes, and Whitehead again dwells on this in Adventures of Ideas, his chapter, the New Reformation, where he talks about the importance of the Trinity. It's a very process relational vision of the divine.
Exactly.
Schelling has his lectures on the deities of Samothrace, looking at the history of the Trinitarian vision going far beyond, earlier than Christianity itself. So these two great process thinkers also recognizing the significance of the Trinity as a symbol that I think goes beyond the ability of propositional thought to grok, but nonetheless can inspire us if we can relate to it in a participatory and experiential.
Moltmann says that it's a very good expression of panentheism, and panentheism is something that is central to my way of thinking. Anyway.
Very much. Well, Matt, I know we've emphasized to Ian, now that Whitehead's come up a few times already in this conversation, that the upcoming event is not a Whitehead-centric event per se, even though certainly Whitehead forms the backdrop to both of our organizations. But we also are endeavoring to bring a lot of other thinkers into play. And maybe, Matt, we can move to thinking a little bit about some of the other dimensions of the conference and maybe who's coming or some unexplored regions, at least in this conversation.
Yeah, well, let me just sort of quickly go through. We have 4 different sections over the weekend. The first one on Saturday morning is neuroscience and psychology. And our first speaker in that session will be Alex Gomez-Marin, who Ian, you know quite well, and people who have watched Channel McGilchrist and gone through chapter by chapter as you and Alex discussed the ideas in The Matter with Things will know Alex quite well. He's, of course, he's got a degree in physics and is now a practicing neuroscientist doing very interesting research. The philosopher and cognitive scientist Evan Thompson will also be in that session. Evan worked with Francesco Varela, who you cite a little bit in The Matter with Things. In the early part of his career, they published a book called The Embodied Mind. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that text. It's very important for me, that kind of brings cognitive science and Buddhism into dialogue with one another. And then the third speaker in that session is Tandeka, Reverend Tandeka, who's a Unitarian minister, but also a thinker and theologian who draws on Schleiermacher and affective neuroscience to understand the deeper feeling dimension of religious experience and its connection to some neuroscientific research on emotion and affect, and how that affects how human beings, how the character of human beings is shaped, and how we're driven to religion as a result of these experiences of the sublime, as was so important for Schleiermacher. And Tandeka will also be offering us a kind of non-denominational homily on Sunday morning to welcome us, since it will be Easter after all. And then in the second session, I don't know if you want to comment at all on those three, Iain.
Well, I'm very pleased that they can be part of it, and I do know Evan Thompson's work, and I think referred to it in the Master and His Emissary. But I would love to meet him and talk. I didn't know Tandeka, but I'm looking forward to meeting her.
Great, yeah.
When you said Buddhism, I mean, Evan Thompson's also written a book called something like "Why I'm Not a Buddhist," hasn't he?
Yeah.
And thinks that we all too readily in the modern era kind of link Buddhism with science and philosophy.
Yes, well, he's very critical of what's called Buddhist modernism, right? Which would be the idea that you can strip Buddhism of its cultural trappings and all the metaphysics and just have the part that's scientific or would be compatible with what modern science says. You know, he thinks that's a product of colonialism, and that we need to recognize that Buddhism is just as richly metaphysical as any of the Western religions are. And so, yeah, it's quite a cheeky title for the book, but it's a great book. And yeah, Evan's just a deep thinker on so many topics, whether it's the philosophy of biology or the role of meditation and changing the brain. He's written another book on sleeping, dreaming, being, I believe it's called, about what contemplative experience can tell us about human nature. So yeah, I'm very excited to have him join us.
And
we have our second session on physics and biology, where the philosopher of physics, Ruth Castner, will be speaking, and she's of course developing what's called the transactional. I shouldn't say of course. Quantum physics is there's nothing simple about it, but she's developing this transactional interpretation of quantum theory, which is process-oriented and really trying to make sense of otherwise confounding findings and experiments in physics. And I'm quite excited to see how she's going to bring that into dialogue with this idea of a brain asymmetry. There are connections that she's working through, so it'll be exciting for her to present that.
I'm really looking forward to that.
And a friend of Andrew and mine, Timothy Eastman, a plasma physicist and philosopher, will be joining us. And you know, he's recently published a book, Untying the Gordian Knot, that also has a lot to say about asymmetries in our understanding of the natural world in terms of basically the world as already actualized, which we can understand, he thinks, through measurements and Boolean algebra and binary code and everything, and then the world of possibilities, or res potential, as he would refer to it, where you know, things like the principle of non-contradiction don't apply anymore. You know, before the quantum waveform collapses, right? You have this field of possibilities, and he wants to understand reality and the natural world in a way that isn't just a bunch of already actualized stuff, but that also has
No,
this possibility and potentials. And so very Whiteheadian
very
vision,
important.
but he's
Very
very
Yeah.
much. Yeah.
interested to see how he connects this to the hemisphere hypothesis, because you can start to see
Yep. Yep.
connections. And you've mentioned Michael Levin, the developmental biologist, whose work on bioelectric fields continues to blow my mind.
Yeah.
Joining us remotely. Everyone else will be in person. Mike has to join us virtually. And then the third session is on philosophy and aesthetics, and I'll be in that session. Iain, you'll be happy to know I'm planning to present something on truth. I think my talk will be titled "In Defense of Truth," drawing on Whitehead, of course, and probably some
Yeah.
Schelling and your work, Iain. And then another colleague of mine at CIS in our MFA program, she's faculty in that program, Carolyn Cook. She's an author, she writes fiction, and her talk will be titled "In Defense of Fiction." So, and we've, she and I have spoken, we're not going to be at odds with one another. There's a way to defend and defend fiction and still be friends.
Just give us the facts. Yes.
And Zach Stein, who you've been in dialogue with before, will also be in that session. I imagine he'll be
great.
His work on cosmoerotic humanism to what you're doing in your work. He's a very deep thinker. He thinks about education as well, and the crisis in our educational systems. So he'll have something quite wise to share with us, I'm sure.
I think he's writing on metaphysics currently as well.
Yeah.
I know Iain, you and Zach had the discussion of value substance some months ago, where we were going back and forth with respect to Shaler's work and a little bit of Whitehead. Values as ontological primitives, which is probably the direction I will endeavor at the conference. So that was a great conversation.
Oh, splendid. Oh, that's great. I look forward to that.
Yeah, so Andrew will be speaking on our final fourth session on Sunday morning on spirituality and the sacred. And Andrew, you'll be alongside John Vervaeke and Richard Tarnas, both of whom Iain, who will try to bring it home for us. And after that, we'll have about 90 minutes just for integration and conversation. We'll kind of get everybody in a circle and just see what ideas are most alive after spending this weekend together. And I don't know that we'll be able to tie a neat bow on it, given how many perspectives will have been thrown on the table, but we'll do our best to harvest.
It's a process. It doesn't have to be a knot.
We're untying the Gordian knot here.
We're untying it. Yeah, very good. It's really so exciting for me. I mean, all these people, I know enough about their work to know how it makes bridges with my concerns. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Wonderful.
I think also, I was just going to say about Alex, that Alex sort of approached me to do this long series, 30 talks about the 30 chapters of the thing. And I didn't know him at that stage, but I got to know him since pretty well, as you can imagine. And I think he's, one of the most astonishing minds of his generation. He really is. So that will be great.
Yeah, I mean, it's bringing together physics and neuroscience to have in both is quite impressive and positions him to make an important contribution. So, yeah,
definitely.
And Matt, maybe we should also just say we do hope and anticipate to publish a volume based on the conference presentations as well, and just so we can continue to keep the conversation going beyond just the event itself. So we'll have more information on that, I'm sure, as we continue after the conference.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, unless you have any other final thoughts, Iain or Andrew, I think we can call it a day and just welcome people to register for the conference online and join us over the weekend. If you are online, you also will be welcome to ask questions during the discussion period. So you are a participant and not just an observer. And we'd love to have you join us.